You want to learn more about the history of our fantasy sports industry? Who better to learn from one of the all-time champions, a person who's written a book about how to win at fantasy baseball as well. Now he has written a book about the history of fantasy sports. He's Larry Schechter, and he joins me next on the RotoWire Fantasy Baseball Podcast. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the RotoWire Fantasy Baseball Podcast, brought to you by our good friends from SoRare and from Prize Picks. Jeff Erickson here, and I'm here with our good friend Larry Schechter, who has a new book out called The History of Fantasy Sports. Larry, welcome. How are you?
I'm good. How are you, Jeff?
Doing well, doing well. Wish my ToutWars team was a little bit better, but other than that, I'm doing pretty well. But I'm fascinated to read your book, because I spent a good amount of time with you, and I know Peter Schenke spent a lot of time with you discussing a lot about our knowledge of the history of the industry and the hobby, not just the industry, but the hobby itself too. And I like that you did. This is like the most comprehensive history of our game.
Yeah, and this is the first. It's not. I wouldn't say it's the most comprehensive. I would say it's the first comprehensive history. That was my goal, was to write the entire history. How did we go from some ideas people had years ago for games to where we are now, where we've got millions and millions of people playing dozens and dozens of different games all over the world, and we got websites and podcasts and analysts and Sirius XM radio and everything that we have now. It's like, how did this happen? And I've been playing since about 1990, and since I've been in Tout Wars and LABR, I know a lot of the people like you that have been involved in some of this growth. But even then, I mean, I had really no idea. And
right.
When so this book is the first ever telling of what happened. It covers from the very beginning, things like tabletop games that were played in the 1800s, through like APBA and Strat-O-Matic, then the creation of fantasy football, the creation of fantasy baseball. I've got like 22 chapters about this different stuff. There's a chapter about stat services, news services, high stakes games, first publications, radio, TV, fantasy sports worldwide. Everything is covered. And when I started it, I had no idea what I was getting into. I mean, I thought this was something I could talk to 30 people and knock it out in a few months or something. And I had no idea. It was just a crazy amount of work. I spent 18 months of research. I did about 100 interviews. People like you mentioned, Peter Schenke, Greg Ambrosius, Rick Wolf, Dan Okrent, Mike Levy, the guy who started Sportsline. I mean, I talked to lots and lots of people at length, a lot of Zoom interviews, massive amount of research online. And I'm incredibly proud of what I've got, because as I was doing it, I would find out things and I would go like, oh my God, this is amazing. And I would learn something, and that would send me down 4 more rabbit holes that I had to investigate. And early on, I realized I could write this kind of like writing the facts and figures of what happened when and who did what, and that would tell the whole story, but it would also be like a very boring research paper. So what I realized is what would be good is like to include that, but write the stories of the people that were involved.
Of course.
Yeah.
That sounds like a perfect path to take. So I want to go back, because you said it started in the late 1800s. This is
well, not fantasy sports, but kind of like the first tabletop games, where you'd have like a board with like a spinner, and you would like flick a penny with your finger into this hole or whatever, and like this bat on a spring would hit it, and it was like a ball would fall into a hole, like single, double, triple, out, that sort of thing. And then from there you had like Catacote Ellis All-Star Baseball was a board game that was really popular.
Oh yeah.
And then you got into like APBA first, and then Strat-O-Matic came about. And when I started the book, I knew that some people consider like APBA and Strat-O-Matic precursors of fantasy. For me, I didn't really think, consider them precursors so much because they're based on, they're board games, they're based on past season statistics. They're really quite different than the fantasy games that we play.
Mm-hmm.
But, when I started to research it, I thought, well, yeah, there's a difference, but they really were precursors in a big way. And it's really amazing. Like there are people that have been playing Strat-O-Matic and APBA in leagues for years and years. And I thought, maybe I just have a couple of paragraphs of mentioning them. It turned out to be like most of a chapter. And one of the most amazing stories that I came upon was about an APBA league that has been they've been together for like 45 years or something like that. And there's a guy that, after being in the league for 34 years, had ALS. And when he got ALS, he thought he'd have to quit the league. His wife told him, look, if you want to keep playing, I'll do whatever I need to do so you can play. So she started playing with him. She would roll the dice and he'd kind of whisper what to do. And a couple of years later, he was at the point where the only way he could communicate was with some kind of computer hookup where he would move his eyes or something like that. And in this condition, his 39th year in the league, he came from 2 runs behind in the bottom of extra innings to win his first ever, after 39 years, championship in this APBA league.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it is amazing. Like I read that, just, oh my God. And and in my book, I tell the story. I also showed the link to their website where you can actually see an article that was written in the local newspaper about them. And I just kept coming up upon, one story after another. It was like, there's stuff that's interesting, inspirational, humorous, and a few things like this guy with the ALS, bring a tear to your eye. And the book is called The History of Fantasy Sports. The subtitle is, and the stories of the people that made it happen. Because that's really the key that, makes it something that, it makes it so good. And I think it's a great book. Anybody listening to this podcast is obviously very interested in fantasy sports, and anybody who likes fantasy sports is going to love the book. And I'm not trying to sound arrogant like I wrote something great, because I didn't make this all up. It's just the information that I was able to get from researching and interviewing people is what's great. And I compiled it all.
How difficult was it to pare down all the wonderful stories that you came across?
It was hard. Think about, try to think of what you had for lunch yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
That can be hard enough. But then, I'm asking people about stuff that happened 20, 30, 40 years ago. And I'm also trying to get information. So it was difficult. And, there was conflicting information. Sometimes I felt like I was like an investigator. I felt like, sometimes I would watch my Zoom videos back with people and I would feel like I looked like an attorney conducting a deposition. I'm like, well, Jeff, you just said this yesterday, but in an article 20 years ago, you wrote the opposite. Were you lying now or were you lying then? It's kind of like, it was hard in some cases finding out the truth. There's some things I heard where I thought like, oh my God, wow, this is really amazing. I got to put this in the book. And then I would find out it actually wasn't true.
Yeah. And the thing is, sometimes it's a question of, are our memories faulty? Or in other times it's like, this was your interpretation of what happened versus what other people interpreted versus what actually happened. There could be many versions of someone's truth.
It's a lot of that. And then there's also a little bit, I think, of, in certain situations, people were trying to embellish a story to make it sound better.
Mm-hmm.
But like one thing this is kind of like a very minor detail, but there's a chapter about the FSTA, Fantasy Sports Trade Association, which is now the Fantasy Sports and Gaming Association.
Right.
So that chapter tells the whole story of how that came about. And the very first FSTA board meeting was in Tampa, and just trying to find out who was actually the first board members. That was very difficult. Some people said there were 10 board members on the original board. Some said there were 12. Most of the people there, it was very easy to figure out who were there. But the last couple of people, it was difficult to figure out, okay, who was on the first board.
Right.
And, that's something that's not like a really big deal and not like of great interest. People aren't going to read the book and go like, oh my God, I'm fascinated to know who these 12 people were on the board. But it's a detail I wanted to get correct because it's also a history book trying to document everything.
Right.
And for example, Christina Schellhart, who used to work with the Sporting News, she was one of those original board members. And John Zaleski, who used to be with Ultimate Fantasy Sports, was also an original board member. And, when I interviewed John Zaleski about his business and also about the FSTA, and I at that time, I was still trying to pin down the last couple of board members. And I mentioned Christina Schellhart, and he said like, oh, no. There were no women there, but actually she was there, so it's just a kind of thing where, 25 years ago, you don't remember stuff like that. But Zaleski did tell me one story I like. At the very first board meeting, there were 12 people there, and they got together at like a long, lawyer-like conference table, and Zaleski's sitting at one end, and a guy from EA Sports is sitting at the other end. And before the meeting started, they look at each other, and they start laughing out loud. And without saying a word, they just look at each other, start laughing out loud. And, a couple of the other people there were like, what's so funny? Mm-hmm. And simultaneously, Zaleski and the other guy simultaneously say, we're at a fucking board meeting for fantasy sports.
Yeah. That's so funny.
Like whoever thought we'd be at a board meeting for fantasy sports?
And, that thought comes to mind at various points in my career. It's like, I can't believe I'm doing this for a living. And that, I've been doing it for 25 years. It's a crazy thing. I know John, or I knew John. I haven't been in touch with John Zaleski in probably 10 years, but I remember at one point he came up with an idea for a DFS contest. He could have been, he was in on the ground floor along with others. They're trying to launch DFS companies, and his didn't quite take off like others, but it was one of those things like, if only he had gotten the critical mass instead of like DraftKings or FanDuel. It's kind of funny. Like you could see how the industry might have evolved a little bit differently there.
Yeah, there are a few other stories like that too. People who kind of just missed it.
Yep.
Or if they had known how big fantasy was going to get, they would have invested more at the beginning.
Sure. Well, I mean, just look at the founders of Rotisserie baseball. It's been well documented that, they didn't profit a whole lot out of, and basically at all about founding Rotisserie Sports, that this thing took off. And, people, while some people remember, like Dan Okrent is especially, in fact, we saw Uncle Ted in the chat, remember Dan, but, they didn't really ride this wave like a lot of other people did.
Well, they didn't. They made very little money. Dan Okrent estimates they each made maybe $10,000 or $15,000. But the problem was they tried to copyright it, but it's there's nothing you can really trademark. It's easy to copy. All you got to do is change the name. So they trademarked the name Rotisserie Baseball, but people quickly figured out all you got to do is change the name. And you don't have to use their trademark, and you don't have to pay them anything. And so that's why it became fantasy baseball, because people just changed the name so they wouldn't have to, pay those guys anything for the name.
Yeah, that's right. And there was a whole, then at one point, John Benson bought the original rules and then, tried to enforce his copyright on that and all that. Ron Chandler documents that pretty well in his book too.
Yeah. Yeah, and one thing I'll say about Okrent is there, there's a perception among some people or a lot of people that Dan Okrent magically came up with this idea for his game on a plane ride from Connecticut to Texas, and that's not at all true.
Okay, tell me more.
Well, it goes back to his college days, there was a professor when he went to, I think it was Michigan, and his professor played like a very primitive game of fantasy there, like very, very easy, primitive. And that's where he first kind of got the idea and then heard about it. And he was not really interested in playing that game at the time, but it developed over years. And he played Strat-O-Matic. There's a lot of connection with people who played Strat-O-Matic.
Right.
And he kind of developed the idea over several years. So when he got on that plane ride to Texas, he actually had already developed the whole concept.
Okay. So yeah, I love how like there's the whole like the legend and how it conflicts a little bit with reality, and that's probably true in a lot of different stories.
Yeah. And I actually somewhere during the process, when I was researching all this, and after I had kind of learned the whole story about Oakland and what actually happened, I picked up a copy of my first book, Winning Fantasy Baseball, which was written 10 years ago. I don't remember why, but for some reason I picked it up and I read a little bit of it. And at the beginning, I basically acknowledged Oakland for creating this game on a plane ride or something. It's like I really 10 years ago when I wrote this first book, I thought that legend was true.
Right. And you assume that was fact, and then you dig in a little bit more, and then you find out more details and flesh it out. It's kind of funny how that always seems to work that way. There are a lot of different ways to play fantasy baseball. One of them is So Rare, and they're one of our sponsors right now. Have you ever dreamed of stepping into the shoes of a general manager? Welcome to So Rare MLB, a groundbreaking fantasy baseball game where you call the shots. Take charge and make your managerial mark by collecting officially licensed digital player cards of your favorite MLB stars. These aren't just any cards. They're your ticket to compete for over $1 million in total cash rewards and other amazing prizes. Imagine winning VIP trips to the MLB 2024 All-Star Game or getting your hands on signed merchandise from top MLB players. Here's how it works. Use your cards to set your lineup each game week. Real-world plays like hits, strikeouts, and homers will power your team's performance. Climb the leaderboards and snag weekly wins, from cash prizes to more cards and unforgettable experiences. But there's more. Build an iconic collection of your favorite teams and players to unlock gameplay bonuses and exclusive rewards. The rarer the card, the higher your score, and the bigger your edge in competitions. And when you're ready to trade, the So Rare Marketplace offers a vibrant community of managers. Engage in live auctions, make instant buys, or trade cards peer-to-peer. Starting is absolutely free. Draft your first team of common cards today and feel the thrill of the competition as you climb the ranks to baseball mastery. What are you waiting for? Join So Rare MLB today. Transform your passion for baseball into a quest for glory and get rewarded for your baseball savvy. Sign up today with the link in the description and get 50% off your first pro cards up to $50. It's your passion rewarded. Big thanks to our friends at So Rare for joining us on the RotoWire Baseball Podcast. I'll post that link in the chat as well if people are interested in checking that all out. I am here, though, however, with Larry Schechter. And Larry's book, The History of Fantasy Sports, is now out. Larry, what's the best way to get a hold of your book?
It's on Amazon and Barnes & Noble, paperback and ebook. It'll be available elsewhere later, but for now you can get it at Amazon, Barnes & Noble. If you just go on there and search History of Fantasy Sports, you'll find it.
All right, very good.
You'll also see more of a description, table of contents. You got editorial reviews and the first customer reviews.
Awesome. And how has it been, the response so far?
Response so far has been great. I mean, there's only there's like I think 4 reviews so far. I mean, it just launched a week ago. There's 4 reviews so far on Amazon, and they're all great. And the editorial reviews that I got are great. Like one of them is from Paul Charchian.
Oh yeah,
and Charchian, he was the president of the FSTA from 2009 to 2020, and he's been in the industry his entire life. And he said, like, a lot of the stuff that he read he had never heard before, and it was like very enlightening. And this is a guy who's been in the industry his whole life, and Yeah, I could read you some reviews, but I guess I won't
That's all
bother. They're really good.
Very good. I'm glad to hear. Baseball isn't the only fantasy sport. Fantasy football actually is a sport that actually in some forms has been going, I think, since the 50s and 60s, right?
Yeah, well, fantasy football started in about 62 or 63. And, like Oakland's fantasy baseball was, I believe it was 79, if I remember correctly. I wish I had like a better memory because, I've made myself the world's leading expert on the history of fantasy sports.
Yeah.
Like nobody but me knows all this stuff. Now, people that read the book are going to be a close second. But yeah, football started first and then baseball. And there's now, there's everything, there's like 30, 40, 50 fantasy sports. You even got like fantasy wakeboarding, fantasy Iditarod, you got like everything. Now, there were a lot of people playing kind of primitive versions of fantasy baseball before Dan Oakland started his game. What set Oakland apart is two things. The game Oakland came up with, which is really still what like the modern. We still play basically the auction format that he came up with. His game was much more complex and involved than what other people were doing. That's the one thing that set it apart. And the second thing that really set it apart is Oakland was a writer, and the people that he got into the first league were all in like the publishing industry somehow. So they spread the word. They started getting articles published in the New York Times and elsewhere. And so their game spread the word and everybody started to learn about it. Whereas you had a whole bunch of other people playing, kind of primitive versions, but it was just like a group of guys on their own and, nobody was hearing about it. So their game wasn't spreading.
Okay.
Yeah. There's some interesting formats that people were playing. Lenny Melnick, a lot of people know Lenny Melnick,
Yep.
famous, radio and TV guy, legend in fantasy. When he was, I think it was like 7 years old, he played a game against, he had like another 7-year-old friend. That friend's dad and Lenny played a game for a penny a point, where they chose a few players and had a few categories, like, the most home runs or whatever, like a penny a point.
Nice.
Brian Matthews. Most people don't know who Brian and Carol Matthews are, but they were very instrumental in the history of fantasy sports. They started CDM along with Charlie Weger, and but Brian, years ago, before he ever started CDM, his first rotisserie league, they used actual money for bidding. A lot of people would use, the $260 auction budget, and a lot of people use real money to put in for a prize pool. But Matthews League, they had no limit for the bidding. You could spend as much real money as you wanted to.
Okay.
And one year, a guy bought Ricky Henderson for $2,000.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. So this league, they had the prize money was split for the top 4 finishers. And so some years, the people who finished like second, third, or fourth might win more than the guy who finished first based on how much money they spent at the auction.
Okay.
Now here's the one you're going to like. On the other hand, there were some people that wanted to use real money, but they didn't have very much money. They couldn't even afford the $260. So their auction, they used $15 of real money.
Yeah.
That's your league. That's why I say that's your league. Right.
Yeah.
So when at the end of the auction, the Jeff Erickson League would have, instead of like dollar days, they would have penny days. The less guys would go for a penny.
Yeah, that was Peter. That's the way Peter Schenke, when he started the league in college, and I maybe joined 2 or 3 years in, and we still to this day, it's called Amiki is the name of the league, and it's ale only. It's 4x4, except we grandfather the brewers in, so it's 4x4 ale only with the brewers. We have a $15 budget, and we bid on dime increments, but you can spend like all of your budget on like 13 players if you want, or you could spend your reserves. People could do, you didn't have to like have exactly 23 players with those $15. So it's interesting. We still do that format to this day.
Yeah. It's still $15.
Yep.
Okay.
And so I have to run that every year. I kind of have to run that translation in my mind. Like, okay, what's a dollar player worth? Okay. Yeah. Okay. This is worth it still, and all that. And much hilarity ensues, but we've resisted some pushes to change it. I think some people want to go to the 260 format. Other people are like, no, this is what we've always done. So it's pretty funny.
Yeah, there was one league where some people, they use certain categories, and they would each draft an entire team. Like they would each have like something like 3 guys, and they would each have like 8 Major League Baseball teams, and they get their stats for different categories. And the thing with those guys is they took teams. It never occurred to them to take individual players.
Yeah.
And Emil Cadlick, who's another like fantasy legend, he started a huge magazine business, and he was one of the co-founders of the World Championship of Fantasy Football. Emil has been in the league for years and years and years with some friends, and it's basically just like touchdowns. Like you get points for touchdowns, and like every couple of years, Emil would try to suggest to them, like, maybe let's add some yardage or something else.
Right.
And these guys would be like, point per reception. What the hell is that? We don't need to change anything. We got the best league ever.
Yeah, I know. It's funny how that it works that way. I had when the news came out about Emil battling his health issues, I had Bob Harris on, because he started a GoFundMe to help that.
Right. Yep.
And Emil is really big into the history of fantasy football, and so his website's dedicated to a lot of like interviewing people that have in the founders in the fantasy football community. It's some really good stuff there. You should search it out. People should search it out, check it out. Some really good stuff there.
I that's in my bibliography. My bibliography's got like 400 entries or so.
I bet.
Yeah, and I did read stuff that's on Emil's site.
Mm-hmm.
And what I would do is like the topic, like, how did fantasy football get created, and other topics. I mean, I just read like one article after another to the point where I would just be reading, 97% of the information I'd be reading for like the 20th time. But every so often, somebody would say something new that I hadn't heard before. And then there's another rabbit hole. Yep. Yeah. Well, in that case, it wasn't even another rabbit hole, just like a little added information. So, I think my one chapter on the origins of fantasy football has got like everything written or said about it combined into one comprehensive, this is what happened.
Oh, very cool. Very cool. We're going to talk more about Larry's personal history in fantasy sports and fantasy baseball. But first, quick note from our friends at Prize Picks. Prize Picks is the best way to get action on sports in more than 30 states across the country. Prize Picks is really simple to play. I can make my picks and submit my entry in less than 60 seconds. You just pick more or less on two or more player stats and watch the winnings roll in. And you can do it for any sport: baseball, football, basketball, hockey, golf, you name it there. You can cover it there. And, obviously the PGA has created some opportunities for people to do that. Looking at today's slate, I think one of the big things that people are interested in jumping in on is just like, for instance, a lot of the Reds Dodgers are today. There's a lot of props you can, or a lot of projections you can go. LA De La Cruz has got half a total base is one of the projections. I'll be in on that, so you can check that out. Quick withdrawals, easy gameplay, and an enormous selection of players and stat types are what make Prize Picks the #1 daily fantasy sports app. Download the app today and use code ROTOPOD for a first deposit match up to $100. That's promo code ROTOPOD for a first deposit match up to $100. Pick more, pick less. It's that easy at Prize Picks. Big thanks to Prize Picks for their sponsorship. Also, we're on the Blue Wire Network. Here are their ads real quick. All right. Thank you for your indulgence there on everything. I'm here with Larry Schechter. He has a new book, The History of Fantasy Sports. You can check it out on Amazon, wherever you buy books online. He also wrote Winning Fantasy Baseball about 10 years ago, too. And that's kind of a gateway to this next part of the conversation, Larry, because I first got introduced to you hearing about you doing so well in the CDM Diamond Challenge, winning multiple years. In fact, I think consecutive years, right?
It wasn't consecutive. It was 2002 and 2005.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah,
and is that your first exposure to fantasy baseball? Any form of fantasy baseball?
No, my first exposure was about 1990, roughly. I lived in Boston at the time, and I was just driving somewhere one day, and I heard an ad on the radio for something called World of Sports.
Okay.
It sounded very interesting, and that was a guy running a fantasy baseball league, and I joined it, and it was the draft was done on a conference call back then.
Okay.
Yeah, and so I played that for I think it was a year or two, and then they went out of business, and I discovered this in the either in the USA Today or the Sporting News, I forget which. I discovered the CDM Diamond Challenge. So okay. CDM was the second, my second game that I played, and I played that for years. And then when I won the 2005 overall Diamond Challenge, that's when they had set up a deal where the winner of the Diamond Challenge got to be in LABR.
Okay.
So that's how I got into LABR in 2006 because of that.
Right. And you did very well pretty quickly in LABR and in Tout as well. AL Tout Wars, I've played with you for, I guess, what, 20 years almost now? Pretty
something
close.
Like that.
Yeah.
I remember when I wrote this in Wayne Fantasy Baseball. I wrote this that when I was invited into Tout Wars, I was invited something like a week or 10 days before the auction. They invited me to join Tout Wars in the mixed auction league, and I had never played a mixed auction, and I only had like a week before the auction, so I really didn't know what I was going to do. But if you get invited to Tout Wars, you're not going to say no. So I said, sure, I'll join. And I had a week to figure out how a mixed auction works. And yeah. And that's kind of like that reminds me of like some of the stories in my new book. I'll just mention quickly, there were people that did the same kind of thing. Like, for example, speaking of CDM had a baseball game, and they were and they were about to launch a basketball game. And they were trying to get a big sponsorship, and they had a meeting with the Sporting News, and they pitched the Sporting News to sponsor the baseball game and the basketball game. And the Sporting News, Bill Topaz from the Sporting News, he decided, I would like to do this, but if I'm going to do it, I want to do it for all 4 sports that we have annual magazines. So not only baseball, basketball, but football and hockey. And CDM, the guys at CDM, having no plans to do hockey or football, and having not started it, they're like, "Oh, sure, we can do that. We'll do that." And then they had to figure out how to do that. It's like there's like several stories like that where people got this opportunity, and even though they had no plans to do it, like, "Oh, sure, we'll do that."
Yeah, of course. Like, "Oh, sure, we'll cover hockey. Oh, sure." And it's funny, we'll have a DFS product. We didn't, without having, and you really kind of, our background was in traditional fantasy sports. "Oh, sure, we'll add this, we'll add that."
Right.
It's funny, like for that matter. "Oh, sure, I'll do a radio show. I have no communications background. But we've got a contract to do it, so here we go. We'll do that." There's so many things that it's funny how this industry, how this sport, this hobby has evolved. I mean, the fact that we're doing this right now, doing a live stream, this is now commonplace. But this is nothing I envisioned when we started RotoWire way back in the day.
No, well, I mean, back then, you wouldn't even envision doing a live stream for anything, let alone fantasy sports.
Exactly right. Yeah, you mentioned that your first tout experience was a mixed auction league, and it's funny because when for the longest time, rotisserie was always about AL only, NL only. Mixed, mixed leagues were this weird animal that everybody looked down on, and now they're by far the most commonplace.
Sure. I mean, you get, for one thing, you get better players. You don't have to worry about, who's the backup second baseman on the Phillies, or, who's some,
Right.
Some catcher, who can be my second catcher that's crappy, but not too crappy. So that's one thing that's appealing about the mixed leagues is you get better players, and also you can take somebody from, you got more teams to choose from.
Yeah. When we started out, fantasy baseball dwarfed fantasy football. Especially from an industry standpoint, there were a lot of fantasy baseball companies, very few fantasy football companies. That's been turned on its head and then some. It's football's orders of magnitude bigger than baseball. Uncle Ted asked the question, how do we grow fantasy baseball like fantasy football has? I think it's a good question. I don't know the answer to it. I don't know if it's possible at this point.
No, the answer is it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
I mean, football's always going to be, football took over baseball a long time ago, and it's always going to be that way. Football, it's just more popular, and it's a little bit easier to play football. But, baseball's a long grind every day for 6 months if you're playing season long. Baseball's still very popular. Lots of people play it. But yeah, it's never gonna start growing like that again.
Man, I think there's a lot of factors there too. I mean, every single football game is televised. It's once a week. You have the
right. Yeah.
I think structurally, it's a lot easier for those who are trying it out. It's not as imposing. Whereas fantasy baseball, oh my gosh, 162 games. Oh my gosh, there's how many players are we drafting? I think all these things kind of contribute to that. I also think the game itself. I love baseball. You love baseball. I'm never going to stop loving baseball, but football is more accessible just as a sport, let alone a fantasy sport.
Yeah. I mean, there's just,
yeah,
that's just the way it is. Yeah.
And I think Uncle Ted's follow-up comment is correct too. He says, I feel the NFL does a much better job of promoting fantasy than MLB does by far. I'd agree with that. And there's a lot of history on that too, about the role that the leagues have played in either growing and or suppressing fantasy sports.
Yeah, one of the dozens of people I interviewed is Clay Walker, who used to be the head of the NFL Players Association, and he was like ahead of his time, realizing that fantasy was actually good for the NFL and good for the other professional leagues. When the leagues and the players associations were mostly totally against fantasy, they thought it was ruining the game. They thought it was gambling, all this other stuff. Clay was ahead of his time, realizing, that the people who play fantasy are watching more games on TV. They're buying more merchandise. They're buying the TV packages, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there was a phase there where the players associations for both football and baseball were trying to force companies to buy licenses to be able to talk about fantasy sports. And they tried to restrict who could do it and try to limit it to the big companies. I mean, we went through a pretty tough phase in the early 2000s on that.
Right. Well, that's why I didn't get into this earlier, but when I mentioned Brian and Carol Matthews are like two incredibly important people in history, it's because CDM is the company that sued Major League Baseball about the licensing rights issue, because Major League Baseball against media was going to shut them down.
Yep.
And they sued them, and thank God they won. And that, I mean, if they had lost the case, that would have really, really damaged the whole industry. We wouldn't be where we are now.
Exactly. Let's talk about this season in Tout Wars. You and I are playing together in AL Tout Wars as always. You're in second place right now. I'm somewhere below second place. I'll say that.
Somewhere below second and above 13th.
Yes, exactly. It depends. It kind of varies on the day to day, but
right.
You're doing well despite slow starts to Corey Seager, to Cedric Mullins, for instance. There, I knew you were a little bit unhappy, if I recall, coming out of the auction, that you had a tough time getting the players at the prices you wanted. Is that accurate?
Well, I think it was overall it was pretty good, but at the end I blew it a little bit with the money. I wasted some money at the end.
Okay.
Yeah, and then it's like I'm in second place. If you ask me why I'm in second place, I really don't even know. I mean, like there's been some good things and some bad things. I mean, you mentioned Corey Seager's had a slow start. Josh Lowe and Vaughn Grissom both got hurt after I had, when I bought them at ToutWars at full price, and then they got hurt after that, and both missed like 4 or 5 weeks. I've had a couple of good things. I took a shot on Tommy Pham on reserve at the draft, and Pham signed with the AL, and he's playing full time for the White Sox, so that was a good thing. I got Justin Verlander for $3, which as of now has turned out to be a really good thing. But it's a long season.
Yeah, it is. And the thing is, I find it's so hard to roster enough hitting. I felt like I tried to do a better job of that this year. I spent 200 of my 260 budget on hitting. And then I look at the standings and I'm still very middling in the offensive categories there. And some of that is just, you got to get the right players too. Some of it, but it's really frustrating that I tried to get better hitting this year. I tried to focus on that, and I still look at my roster and, well, I made some mistakes. Like I'm the guy that bought Jackson Holiday, and that's not working out so far. I'm gonna have to wait a while on that one there, but I guess I guess I have to figure out, is there a takeaway from that, or is it, did I just get the wrong player? Did I do something wrong structurally?
Well, for me, I've always said it's about the value. In winning fantasy baseball, that's the biggest thing I stress is, so
right.
If you spend $200 on hitting, whether you spend $200 on hitting or $150 on hitting or whatever, you got to get more than your money's worth. If you spend $200 on hitting and you're getting $190 worth of actual value, you're losing $10. So it's about getting the players at a good price.
Indeed. I think that's always a good takeaway. And, it's, which means you have to start off with a good set of projections. You have to start off with a good set of, and how to value those players. And that's a whole nother rabbit hole of a conversation here.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. You got to have a value system. Right.
Exactly. Let's how are your NFBC teams doing? I know you're in at least a couple of main events.
I'm in 3 main events.
Okay.
2 of them are just horrendous. They're like something like 700 overall or something. One of them had Spencer Strider as the #1 pick.
Ouch.
The other one had Corbin Carroll as the #1 pick, and a whole lot of other things have not gone well. I'm still managing those teams, but they're not going to do anything. Now my third team is doing good. My third team is about 100 overall, and it's like in second place in the league. So that team is the one I'm really focused on. That team also had Corbin Carroll as my first pick, but they're doing okay despite that.
What's your theory on Carroll? Why he's struggling so much?
I don't really know. The only ray of hope that I have is last year he also struggled for a month. In the middle of the year, he had a horrible month. And if he had started out like that last year instead of having it in the middle of the season, he probably would have been sent down or something.
Right.
So I don't really have a theory. I'm just hoping it snaps out of it, obviously.
I've kind of speculated on the shoulder before, and I think that might be part of it, but yet he's still playing every day. So almost every day. So obviously the Diamondbacks don't think it's bad enough to keep him out, but it's still frustrating to see him unable to get out of the blocks so far.
Yeah, I have heard about the shoulder. I did not hear about that when I drafted him. I heard about that afterwards. Maybe I heard from you. I don't remember.
Yeah. Well, and it's one of those things where it's like, it hasn't been like officially from the team or anything like that too. So they've been largely silent on that issue, but as is often the case, and that's the thing. It's tricky to find out good information sometimes. And, sometimes you're only as good as the information they allow us to find out. And
of course. Yeah.
So it goes.
Now I will throw in, I'm in first place in LABR.
Okay.
So that's good. So I got 5 teams. Only 5 teams this year. I got LABR, ToutWars, NFBC. I cut back a little bit on my teams. I really streamlined my draft preparation this year because I was so busy getting the book finished. That, like, I even thought about, like, well, maybe I shouldn't play this year, but that wasn't going to happen.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, it's such a time induced. I'm trying to think. It's just such a time suck. Yeah, time consuming. That's what I was going for there.
Yeah.
Such a process there writing the book. I can only imagine. And just the prep work we usually do is time consuming as well.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I remember a friend of mine when I met him years ago. God, this must be 15 years ago or something. I met this guy, became friends. And he asked me, like, what do I do for fun or whatever? And I said, well, I play golf and I play fantasy sports.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, like, oh my God, those are the two most time-consuming hobbies I know of. And you do both of them.
I do, and I do as well. I'm avid but mediocre at golf. And yeah, that's the thing about it can't, you can't play a short round. You can't just go, I'll play for an hour today. No, you can go to the driving range, I suppose, but
right,
I don't want to, and I also don't want to work on golf. I just want to play golf. That's part of my problem. That's why I never improve. But
right, yep.
Yeah, but there you go. Well, I know you got a busy schedule. You are promoting this book everywhere. Tell everybody again how they can get a hold of your book.
You can go to Amazon or Barnes & Noble and search History of Fantasy Sports, and it'll show up. It's available in paperback and ebook.
Very good.
And I really strongly urge everybody to get it, because I'm serious. If you like fantasy sports, which you obviously do, or you would not be listening to this podcast, you will love the book. I promise you, you're going to love this book. I know it's easier for people to say that, or it's a must read, but in this case, it really is. Nothing like this exists. Nothing like this has ever been done before, which is why I wanted to do it.
I can't wait to read it. I'm looking forward to it. Larry, thank you so much for joining me today. Good luck on the book.
Thank you.
Larry Schechter, everybody. Go check that out. And of course, you can follow him on Twitter at Larry Schechter as well. Thanks everybody for listening. Thanks to So Rare. Thanks to Prize Picks for their sponsorship. If you enjoy this podcast, please hit that like button. Please subscribe and give us feedback. We appreciate it all. We do read it all. And also, while you're at it, go ahead and check out the site as well. RotoWire.com/pod is our free look behind the paywalls. You can check that all out. Check out The History of Fantasy Sports by Larry Schechter. Thank you so much for listening. Take care.